and how do you access the support and find out the opportunities to help you to follow that path. So there are some formal ways that you can do that. There are some often published research priorities that your professional association might have produced for you. It might be looking at research funding opportunities. So sometimes there are specific funding models that will push you in a particular direction of research and a particular idea around research. But also it's helpful to sign up to journal subscriptions, attending CPD courses. So you're keeping abreast of recent research activity and thinking about how that might fit with your clinical experience and your personal interests as well. And then also there's the James Lind Alliance, which is the national publication of research priorities. And so that's always worth looking at as well. But for me, I think the thing that really helped me to develop my interest in research, as well as maybe my ideas around what I wanted to research, was through networking. And that can be locally within your trust, or it can be stepping outside of the boundaries of your trust and networking with other research leaders or other people higher up in the profession who might have ideas around where research is headed. And the benefits of networking is it helps you to exchange those ideas, gets you noticed, it opens those doors. It can be a support network as well moving forward. So if you do then follow a research funding pathway, it's really good to have those support networks to fall back on, and it can help you to find a mentor and a sponsor. So I've put about taking a seat at the table, and what I really mean by that is to get involved in whatever research is happening within your area, and that might be something as simple as doing an audit project within your local service, or looking at a service evaluation or a quality improvement project, and maybe contacting your R&D department locally if you do work in a trust to see what kind of research activity they've got going on, looking to see whether you have a clinical trials network locally in the area and what kind of research priorities do they have. So looking at all the different avenues and trying to get involved in that, putting your hand up, saying that you're interested, sometimes being a bit brave, and having a friendly, approachable style with your networking skills so that people remember you when they're thinking about opportunities as they arise. It's really helpful to broaden your horizons, and this is something I've always tried to work hard on doing. So getting involved with committee activities, one really good way to take a step back and see what's going on in your profession and see the direction that maybe the profession is heading in, because it's really helpful to try and formulate your research idea around something that's going to be topical and really interesting to people moving forwards. Going to conferences I found really helpful because you get to hear that really up-to-date research information, and it's inspiring. You're listening to people who are talking about their research and how exciting they find it, and that inspires you as well. Attending networking events, so CAHPR sometimes runs research networking events, and going on courses as well. Obviously, joining social media can be really helpful. You get lots of research ideas through social media. You sometimes have to take it with a pinch of salt. It's about knowing that whatever research you're reviewing, that's been peer reviewed, and that maybe people's interpretation of that, just bearing in mind that might be a one-sided argument. So thinking about, well, if you were to critique that research, what would your thoughts be around that? So trying to think independently around social media activity, but it is helpful to help you understand the direction of topics. And I think it's also really helpful to find a buddy. So trying to find people who are interested in the same topic as you, or just even interested in research, just so that you can be geeks together. You don't feel so isolated, because it can sometimes be isolating. So, maybe setting up a journal club, or, going to some conferences together, something like that. And it can help you with your networking skills as well. If you've got somebody there to back you up, to be your wingman, it can just help you to find your feet a little bit. So once you've sort of done all of your background work in networking, you're understanding, maybe what your interests are, and you've explored that, the next challenge is then to establish a mentoring and supervision relationship, particularly if you're looking at going for a funded research model. So I'd done a lot of the networking, and for quite a few years I knew I was really interested in doing research, but I really didn't have a firm handle on what I wanted to get involved in. And through going to conferences and attending courses, I decided I was really interested in neuropathic pain, and identified some of the leaders in that field of research and people that I thought would be really great mentors and supervisors. And essentially I stalked them in a little bit of a way. I booked onto one of the weekend courses that they were running, And I went there obviously with the purpose of learning about the course because I was really interested in the topic, but also to give an elevator pitch, really, to talk about my research ideas, what I thought would be a good avenue for me to explore, and getting their feedback about that and what did they think. And it was a bit scary having to present your research ideas to somebody who's an expert in that field, and obviously you don't necessarily know nearly as much as they do about the topic. But actually it was a confidence boost because it was received really positively, and it was really great to have that, you know, face-to-face interaction and to be able to explore my ideas a little bit further with them. And fortunately, they agreed to become my supervisors and mentors. So that's been a really positive step forward for me. So when you're looking for a mentor and a supervisor, you're looking for somebody who has that expertise in the field that you're interested in. It has a genuine interest in developing you. And I think the other thing that I found really helpful is if they're willing to share their failures as well as their successes. It's a really good learning tool. There are bumps along the road when you step into a research pathway, and it's really helpful to hear that narrative from other people who've gone through those bumps along the road and come out the other end, and you can see that it's all part of the journey, and that you know, and you just got to keep your head down and keep heading in the right direction and you will get there. So trying to find someone that you've got that one-to-one connection with, I think, is really important. And then thinking about your role as a mentee, so it's very mentee driven, the mentee and supervisor relationship. So you need to determine what you need from that relationship. You need to be clear about what your goals are, what your aims are. You need to be constructive about thinking about the solutions for yourself before coming with a long list of problems, and to, you know, show your true self, be prepared to show a bit of vulnerability, because it is a vulnerable position when you're first headed into research. You know, you're definitely not the expert there. So being honest and open and willing to learn is really helpful. Try to develop the relationship. So it's good to set boundaries around what contact times you want, how long you want the meetings to go on for, what the focus is going to be, what the feedback is going to be, and the accountability around that. And then you can look for, again, support from more national models of research development. So I've highlighted here in orange the NIHR RDS. They were fantastic with me when I started the Pcaf application, and they just had so much knowledge about, you know, what might help you to get funding and what might not be so helpful to get you the funding. And I had, with both of my applications, face-to-face, you know, sort of mentoring and supervising through the application process to really help me to bulk up. For example, they really helped me with the PPI information. So yeah, so definitely networking with some of the NIHR bodies that are available. I've listed some of the other ones, which I won't go through in too much detail, but so for example, the clinical trials unit in Brighton, they do a lot of the actual capturing of the research data, and the biomedical research centres, they tend to be more lab based, and the networks tend to be more collaborating between the NHS and other stakeholders and services. So come and chat to us at CAHPR. So within your local area, there'll be a CAHPR hub, and the purpose of CAHPR is really to support allied health professions to develop research capacity and to embed that within trust activity, and to improve the scale and depth of research that allied health professions are involved in. So each hub will have a chair, and then they can direct you through networking to contacts that might be relevant to your research idea, as well as they organise events. So across the country there are webinars and conferences, and sometimes there's research funding as well. So we might fund somebody to attend a conference to go and present some of their research findings. So always keep an eye out for CAHPR activity, and we're on social media as well. So if you follow us on Twitter, then you can see what we're up to. And so once you've established all of your research ideas, you've got your supervisor and your mentor, then you need to decide what your funding model is going to be, to try and get you that protected time to be able to explore your research further. So a lot of us are on the NIHR ICAP programme, and I'm sure lots of you are familiar with that. And so I won't talk too much about that because you're going to hear lots about that coming up. But there are other funders as well that you can explore. So there are university stipends that you can access, and you can find these through findaphd.com. There are PhD jobs, so there are other avenues to explore around that. There's charitable funding, so people like the Versus Arthritis and Wellcome Trust do sometimes fund PhD. And then you can do a PhD publication, which is more of a self-funded model where you would develop publications. sometimes in your own time, or maybe supported by your trust, and then you develop a minimum number of publications, and then you would go to a panel for interview. So that's it from me.
Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can, but you might
Brilliant.
need to start the slideshow.
Yes, of course. So yeah, I'm Andrew Kemp, and I'm an advanced physiotherapy practitioner working in
Hi,
the
Andy.
Sussex.
Hi,
Oh,
Andy.
sorry.
To interrupt. You still haven't started them.
Is that the next slide?
No, we're still on the original kind of. We haven't started the slideshow yet.
Okay, sorry. Now?
If you can start the slides, we can see the PowerPoint, but
Yeah.
you can't see the start of the actual slideshow.
Do you see it now?
No, we don't. Shall I share for you?
That would be awesome. Thank you, Sinead.
I'll start that now, no problem. You just tell me next slide when you're ready.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So sorry about that. I'm a MSK physiotherapist and an advanced practitioner working across a spine, hip and knee pathway, and I work for the Sussex Musculoskeletal Partnership, which is a partnership of 4 healthcare organisations. And what I'm going to do is talk about my journey leading up to the Pcaf, which is a pre-doctoral clinical academic fellowship, one of the ICAHPR funding programs, and I'm going to talk about that as well. And so I completed my MSc in MSK physiotherapy at King's in 2009, and it really wasn't till after I'd completed that and undertaken my research project as part of my master's that I really considered research and a clinical academic pathway. Next slide, Sinead. And my research journey, I think, has been a bit like this picture. And so, as I say, I thoroughly enjoyed my research project for my MSc, and it was, and I was lucky enough that I had a supervisor who was really interested in my project. And on completion of that, he was keen to work with myself and a couple of other students to publish the findings. And not long after that, I decided I wanted to become more involved in research, and luckily I applied for a 4-year part-time research associate post at University College London. Now, this post was a lower paid post than my NHS post, but I did it purely to gain further research experience, and it was working on a large project between UCL and Imperial College with over £1.5 million of funding. And my first tip would be from my experiences would be to definitely try and get some practical research experience if you haven't already. It would definitely help you to know if research is something that you want to pursue further, and also give funders the impression that you are really serious about research. And just like Jenny said, even better if you can get involved with organisations like CAHPR or the Physiotherapy Research Society, then that's going to look really good on your CV and provide some good experience there. And towards the end of that time, I decided to start. I wanted to get to develop experiences in research further, and I started applying for research funding. But unfortunately, I sort of started at the wrong level, and so I was spent too much time applying for awards without the established academic support, as Jenny has mentioned there. I had sort of tentative support, and I hope that I could build that up as I was going, but actually I got it all in the wrong order. And so my next tip would be that it's really good to think about what support you need, first of all, before you start applying for these funding streams. Some of them you may not need much in the way of academic support, because that might be provided by a university, but some applications you need to have sort of established academic support first of all, and someone who's going to agree to supervise you in developing your project. And after that, I was still keen to be involved in research, and I got one of the circulars advertising the Integrated Clinical Academic Internship, which is a short duration award for those with little or no research experience. And really, this was a great opportunity that I would thoroughly recommend for those without much in the way of research experience, because it funded me to undertake an MSc research module and numerous research workshops. And I learned a great deal through this. And although I wasn't successful in developing a proposal that I could have applied for further NHR funding, purely because it was based on sort of emerging science rather than established science, it was a really good opportunity. And that leads to my next tip, really, which is, whilst it's not essential to have sort of an exact research question in place, if you're going to apply for NIHR funding, that research topic that you're interested in and you want to investigate further needs to be really translatable to patient care. And after that, I sort of got a new job, and it allowed me to, and I stepped off the research career pathway for a while, and that gave me a chance to reflect on what I wanted to do. And I then developed an interest in the area of degenerative meniscal tears. Following an unsuccessful application for the Masters in Research at the I decided to contact one of my current supervisors, who I thought might be interested in my research topic, and luckily for me he was, and he supported me really. He helped me to lead a systematic review and write a research paper to improve my research credentials, and he also supported me to apply for the Health Education England and NIHR Bridging Fund, which is a small grant for those wishing to develop a bigger application. And again, that allowed me to undertake another master's research module. And what I would say is that whilst there is the fellowship opportunities to apply for, it's also good to look at smaller funding opportunities as well, as they may be able to provide you with some time or learning opportunities where you can just increase your research experience. And also, don't be put off approaching academics, people who you think might be interested in your and know your area of research. You might get a response advising that they're too busy, but don't give up. And I then successfully applied for the pre-doctoral clinical academic fellowship, which is where I'm at now. But I applied. It was only on the second time that I was successful. And what was it that converted my first application to a successful application? Well, I think one of the main things was it was choosing the right funding stream. Now, with the pre-doctoral clinical academic fellowship, next slide, Sinead, there are two forms of it. You have the standard Pcaf and the Pcaf bridge, and there's a bit of a difference between these. And the standard Pcaf is funding to support the development and submission of a doctoral fellowship application with master's level academic training, whereas the Pcaf bridge fund is to support the development of the doctoral fellowship again, but there's only a small amount of funding for academic training. And what that looks like in practically is that with the standard Pcaf, you get 1 year full-time salary backfill costs and £5,000 towards master's level training. But with the bridge fund, you only get 2 days a week of for backfill and £400 towards formal academic training. So there's a big difference. But I think it's good to understand why you would apply for one or the other. And so it's really the decision should be based about what your needs are, because I'd already completed 2 master's level research modules and workshops, and I already had practical experience. I decided that my application was likely to be most successful if I applied for the bridge fund, whereas someone with less experience and someone that hasn't had any formal research academic education would maybe better off applying for the standard Pcaf. Next slide, Sinead. And so what have I learned from undertaking my Pcaf? Well, first of all, it's really important to know your why you're wanting to be involved in research, because what I would say, it's really not an easy career option. And so, yeah, that's an important thing to know. I also think you need to be persistent. You need to be willing to learn from others, accept feedback and criticism, and try to take advantage of any opportunities there are to be involved in research. And just as Jenny has said, finding the right academic support is critical. You'll need to be able to get on with your supervisors, and for fellowship funding opportunities, it's really helpful if your supervisors have experience of supervising PhD candidates, and there's a track record of successful applicants. One thing I would say is that you also really need to, if you're applying for a fellowship, you also need to make sure that you've got the support from your line manager at work in the long term. So for these funding opportunities, you really need to demonstrate how you are going to be supported in the long term. Something that's critical. You don't want to be applying for one of these fellowships and actually your work not be on the same page. When applying for a fellowship application, one thing I would say is start writing the sections of the application early. Now, the applications are usually open for a window. The Pcaf was open this year for around about 7 weeks. And whilst you can't populate the application form until the application's open, there are the guidance notes on completing an application are published on the NIHR website, and you can already start thinking and writing those sections that are going to be part of that application beforehand. So things about your research and clinical experience. And if you're applying for one of these fellowships, before you're about to submit an application, just make sure that you've got in contact with your signatories, people that are going to sign off your application at the academic institution or your employers, to know that they're going to receive an email in their inbox asking them to sign it off. What you don't want to find is that someone who needs to sign off your application has gone on annual leave. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it there, because I think the last 2 tips are covered further. So thank you. Have I stopped sharing? Sorry.
Yeah, I think so, Andy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sinead. If you can bring up the first slide, that'd be great. Thank you. Oh, go back one, if you would, please. Thank you. Evening all. I'm Chris Mercer. I'm a consultant physio here, and you can see from the slides I don't take anything personally. So I am a double Pcaf reject. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and kind of how I've dealt with that and managed that going forward. So I had the dream project all arranged, ready for my Pcaf application, and the project was built on the back of a lot of experience and time spent working with people with serious pathology of the spine, particularly Cordra-Quina syndrome. And it came off the back of some work we'd done around developing an international framework with a really brilliant group of people. And I tapped into some of these people, so James Self and Sue Greenhouse from a physio perspective, both of the fantastic track record in research, supporting research, and Anne Moore from the University of Brighton. So, yeah, a really fantastic team, plus a patient who'd suffered with Cordra-Quina. And the plan was to do a brilliant qualitative study looking at patients and their families and carers' experience of Cordra-Quina. So this was a nailed-on, guaranteed success as far as I was concerned. I had a brilliant team and a brilliant idea and a brilliant training program arranged. So imagine my surprise when in 2018, having submitted this brilliant proposal, what I got through was a rejection. So next slide, please. So the 2018 rejection was disappointing, but came with some helpful comments, I think, in terms of how to write an application and how to target it. And I think maybe from that original application, what I'd relied on was being very experienced or old clinically, and having a profile within physiotherapy and expecting that would be enough to carry me through without having really considered the implications of the research and my career development with the project. So the steer was very much around looking at how the award would develop me as a researcher in the years ahead. So in the bottom, in the second paragraph there, you can see it says, given strong professional CV, I should have really demonstrated the reason for a PhD and how that was going to benefit me developing myself as a research leader. So after the disappointment of the first knockback, I kind of dusted myself down and thought, okay, well, these are tough awards to get, so let's have another go. And I spoke to Lisa Roberts, who many of you will know, who again is a very experienced researcher and part of the assessment team for NIHR. And she read through my application, gave some really helpful feedback. Spoke to the rest of the team. Again, kind of tweaked the application and applied again. So what could possibly go wrong this time round? Well, again, there was a rejection, and it wasn't quite such a bad rejection because it was deemed fundable, but not funded, essentially. So I'd gone from being not fundable, which was I took to be basket case, to potentially fundable, which I felt was progress, but not really progress enough for what I was after, really. And I think, again, having taken the rejection quite hard, really, I took it quite personally, as you do. But over time, given the time to step back and think about, well, if I was sitting on the other side of this application, would I have funded it for this experienced clinician? And for kind of experience, you can put old, because there's something around, are people going to fund you Are they going to see a future research leader in you if you can't sell it to them? And I think really that's what I've failed to convey, is a vision of how being successful in this award would develop me as a researcher. So that was one thing I felt, would have been helpful. And as the bottom paragraph says, the final sentence, in order to demonstrate longevity, this is about, is it worth NIHR spending £100,000 to support me to develop a proposal if this isn't going to go long term and have an impact for them long term? So I'd clearly failed to demonstrate that. So I think there was something around what's in it for them as opposed to what's in it for me that I should have conveyed. And I think the first sentence in that last paragraph says, because I've been around a long time and been involved in research, bits and pieces for a long time, maybe I would have been better placed to move straight to a doctoral application. And the reason I didn't do that was a lack of confidence, I think, in my research abilities, my research skills, and not really acknowledging the strong networks that I had and the strong support that I had from a huge number of really experienced researchers. So I think there's something around making sure that you pitch your funding application at the right level and don't undersell yourself in terms of any experience you bring to the table. But really, I think the issue was really about me not being able to demonstrate value for money and longevity around what I'd bring with the project and the kind of development of me as a career researcher, really. Next slide, please. So, kind of looking for some solace, I looked online about failure, and I found all these lovely signs that said failure is success in progress, and it doesn't feel like that at the time. And failure is not the opposite of success; it's part of it. Well, I think as a researcher, anyone who's involved in research will know that this is absolutely true. You have to take the knocks, and Andy's talked about that already. You have to take the knockbacks and have a think about, well, what does this mean for me in terms of next steps? Next slide, please. Thanks, Sinead. So I felt at a bit of a crossroads, really. My hair's not getting any browner, and there's even less of it. So I was really thinking about, well, what does this mean for me career-wise? Am I best invested in trying again? Am I best invested in applying for a doctoral program, which are even more competitive? And how do I stand in terms of my career direction? What's this going to do for me? And possibly, where are my skills best placed? And it took me a long time to think about this, really, in terms of, do I want to be a recognized researcher? Do I want to be more involved in research and make a meaningful difference through research? Well, yes, I do. Am I skilled enough to do that? What this was telling me was probably not. So I took a bit of a step back and thought, well, okay, well, let's have a think about what else you can do, keeping interested in research, dusting myself down, and maybe taking next steps. Next slide, please. So this is Alexander Graham Bell, which is a really nice quote, and people will have heard this. When one door closes, another one opens. Absolutely, but I like the bit afterwards. We often spend so long and regretfully looking upon the closed door that we don't see the one that's opened. And for me, this kind of rings true. I like this quote, but I like my mum's quote even better. It was a pat on the back and a hug, and she said, "Don't worry, we're still proud of you, darling." So I think that's that's kind of much better quote. But it was really about me. Like, okay, well, where are you going to go with this? How are you going to manage research and keep research as part of your role, and still feel that that's of value moving forward? So next slide, please. So Jenny talked about networks earlier on, and I've been involved in audit and research projects for a long time, and those collaborations have stood me in good stead, and those collaborations have continued. So those collaborations continue with musculoskeletal work, but also other papers and other projects. So as a result of these collaborations, and particularly with James and Sue and Laura Finucane, but also collaboration through the team here. So with Kevin, who you'll hear from later, since being rejected for the applications, we've had four papers published. I've been invited to do 4 book chapters. So feel that from those, I'm still there contributing to new knowledge, still there contributing to research agenda, although it's in a different way. What the rejection gave me the opportunity to do is to look at other options in terms of time and how would I want to use my time in my, if I'm thinking about my 4 pillars, if I wasn't going to spend my time in the research pillar, where else might I spend the time that would be fruitful? So it's led to me doing other roles, so seconded roles from a strategic perspective. So it's opened up other doors. These are the other doors that have opened up for me really in terms of where I've focused some energy over the last couple of years. And those have led to increasing my networks, which have now opened up, ironically, the opportunity to do more research. So I had 2 contacts this week about being involved in wider national research projects. So I think it's almost come full circle. But I think what it's really given me the chance to do is think about my role as a research facilitator and as a leader within my role. So I'm a consultant physio, so part of my role is to well, a lot of my role is to develop the service and the team that I work with, and I'm fortunate to work with a brilliant group of people who are dedicated and interested and want to push things forward. So part of my role has been to help facilitate that development and to share my experiences of applying for the Pcaf with people and say, look, if you want to know how to write a proposal that's not going to get you funded, read this one. And it's not to say there were terrible applications, but it's about sharing that. So are my batteries recharged for a further attempt? Possibly. That's me.
Thanks, Sinead, for putting up the slides there. Thanks. So following on from those 3 fantastic talks, I'm going to talk a bit about my experience. I'm Adele Hill, and I've been on a bit of a research journey over my career. Next slide, please. I started off my career in mathematics research. So I qualified in pure mathematics and worked in the civil service for around 8 years doing that before I went back to university as a mature student and qualified as a physio. I worked in a few different NHS trusts across the southeast, a bit of private practice, a bit of sport, before realizing that actually I'd really like to go back to my research roots and try and bring some of that knowledge to the physio profession and add to the research there. Next slide, please. So in 2018, I applied for my first lot of research funding by the NIHR. And over the last 3 years, I've been successful in several different types of funding awards. So from the big sort of, salary backfill fellowships and scholarships right through to small grants for, the odd course or conference or what have you. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about about those and the kind of the similarities and the differences that I found over my experiences of applying for those. So first of all, just kind of some general reflections that I have. Sorry, next slide. On you know, what it all involves, and you know, what has kind of gone right or gone wrong. The first thing is about how much you're putting into your application. So particularly with my Pcaf application, I think I pretty much promised the earth of what I was going to spend my time doing for 2 years, and left myself with a huge hill to climb. So, you know, talking about some previous people's experience of being rejected, perhaps that's part of it. I perhaps overpromised what I was gonna do over the 2 years. So it's quite easy to write a list of things when you're doing the application, but then actually delivering it can be quite difficult. There are huge peaks and troughs in your workload and work-life balance, and that for me is really the nature of research. You know, in my day-to-day clinical job, my hours and my time are fairly predictable, and I can, you know, most of the time get away, you know, at a decent hour. Whereas in research, you're so reliant on other people doing their bit that, you know, there are huge differences in how your weeks look and how much time you get to yourself. So that was kind of a big learning curve going back to it after a few years working clinically. And the last thing was looking at sort of publications and outputs, which was something I didn't really put too much thought into when I first started in this, which might seem odd because I'd been a researcher before, but the nature of the research I'd done didn't really lend itself to publication. So that's definitely something to be thinking about. You know, no matter which funder you're applying to, that's one of the things they want to know about. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah, so and just along those lines, you know, as I say, publications, but also disseminating your work. So thinking about local dissemination, you know, right through to academic journals and conferences. But also things like, you know, how can you get this to the wider public? Are you going to engage on social media? Are you going to let people know via a website, you know, a blog, and those sorts of things? You know, if the funders are going to give you a lot of money to do this, they want people to know about it, and so having an idea in mind of how you're going to let people know about what you're doing is important. Having a good, really project management plan, which includes contingencies and a good kind of timetable of how you're going to achieve what you're going to achieve is really important. They want to know that the money is going to be used. And that you're going to be successful at the end of it, you know, that you will have delivered certain things at a certain time frame, and that if that's not possible, there's some other kind of plan B in the background. Using the researcher development framework, which I've got a slide on in a moment, is a really important part of it, because they want to know that you're not just concentrating on your particular study, but also that you're developing yourself as a researcher. So it's around your career trajectory and how you're going to manage not just performing a study, but all of the other things that come with it, like managing people, like the project management side of things, like developing your skills to deliver it, and in some cases developing your clinical skills as well. As a few people have already mentioned, giving yourself time to put together your proposal is super important. I managed to do my Pcaf application in just under 3 months, and also got married at the same time. But it did mean that I was working on my honeymoon, which I'm still haven't quite lived down. So definitely give yourself more time and to kind of put your plans in place. And certainly for a doctoral level fellowship, you know, I started that at least a year before I was sort of thinking about applying. So you need loads and loads of time to make sure that you've got all your ducks in a row. And then supervision is another thing that they look at. So making sure that the methods that you want to use in your project are adequately supervised by somebody who's used those methods before, or is an expert in that field, or you know, has published in that area. It's a question that came up time and time again through my applications, and in fact, was one of the reasons. So when I applied for the NIHR doctoral fellowship and was rejected, that was one of the big things, was around the supervision of my project. Next slide, please. So this is the research and development framework that I mentioned. So you can find it on the web, but it's a really great resource to make sure that you're hitting all of the different aspects of becoming a researcher, right through from your abilities to undertake a study through to presenting it, and then also just knowing about the kind of the nuts and bolts of research and and managing other people around research as well, particularly with these sort of publicly funded fellowships. They want to know that you're going to be able to lead research in the future, and so having those leadership skills and personal skills to make that happen is really important. Next slide, please. So to talk a bit more about my most recent experience, so that was the clinical doctoral fellowship. I applied first to the NIHR CDRF scheme. I say first, they were pretty much concurrent. So the first thing is that for the NIHR scheme, they have a panel review. So it's people that are, I believe already kind of working for the NIHR, and they closely align your proposal to their panel's expertise. Because it's a clinical doctoral research fellowship, the elements of clinical supervision and development are really important, and they want to make sure that you're looking outside of your local area. So it's not just who your current clinical supervisor is. No matter how good they are, they want you to have a breadth of experience and make sure that you're exploring other areas with that. On the finance side of things, the difference between a sort of Pcaf and a doctoral fellowship, in my experience, has been just how much detail you need on the finances and the finance of your study. And the NIHR have something called a SOCAT, for which you need a properly qualified financial advisor to cost your research costs. Now, that they can be quite difficult to get hold of. They don't necessarily care that you've got a deadline in however many weeks' time, because they've got their own job to do. So planning that in is important to make sure that you've got your costings and your finance sorted, because you can't submit without that qualified person having signed it off. And I mean, certainly when I went through it, I don't know whether things have changed, but I had no feedback. I went through sort of stage 1, stage 2 and interview, and there's no feedback during the process. So you're kind of going through a bit of a blind alley, just kind of hoping that you come out the other side. Next slide, please. And whereas when I applied for charity funding, things are a bit different. There was no kind of professional financial advisor involved, but there was a limit on how much I was allowed to say I was going to spend. So my plans had to come in under their funding limits that they set out from the outset. My research proposal was sent out for full peer review, so I had to nominate 5 or 6 reviewers who were experts in the fields that I was wanting to work in, and they came back with a full review, 5 or 6 full reviews. I had the opportunity to rebut those reviews, so sort of clear up any misunderstandings, or point to any evidence that perhaps I felt had been overlooked, or indeed change my proposal, or incorporate some of the comments that were given. From my point of view, it felt more personal applying to a charity. I was having to deal with the same people throughout the entire process, and it did just feel like they were kind of cheering me on, and they wanted me to be successful, and that was quite nice compared to sort of a big juggernaut like the NIHR, which is a bit more impersonal, I felt. And also they gave me some feedback. So I had some feedback going into the interview. So I kind of had a steer on where I might need to pitch some of the things that they were going to ask me about. And I think that was definitely helpful, because there was, in developing my proposal over 12 months, there were things that I definitely had in my head that I possibly hadn't, sort of written down or said out loud. And so sort of having those steers and those kind of reminders of things that I might need to say was important and really helpful. So yeah, that's all that I have to say about that, and I look forward to Kevin coming on next. Thank you.
Thanks, Adele. That was really interesting. So while I bring up my slides, firstly, thanks to MACP for inviting me, and to CAHPR. And so my name's Kevin Hall. I'm an advanced practitioner. I work with Chris and Jenny and Sam and Adele. So I'm really in the terminal phases of my NIHR CDRF. In fact, I was supposed to hand it in on Monday and failed to do that. So failure, obviously, at every stage. But I am hoping to hand it in next Monday. So that's my plan, final polishing over the next week. And I want to talk about patient and public involvement because, one, it's had a pretty profound effect on kind of my research interests, I suppose philosophy and clinical practice, and it's shaped the direction of my doctoral fellowship, I guess. And it's also fairly fundamental to the research application processes. It needs to be woven into funding applications, I guess, at every level. So I'm going to talk about public and patient involvement, also called, there we go, sorry. Also called public involvement. I think NIH are preferring public involvement as opposed to patient and public involvement, although patient and public involvement is still being used on funding application forms, I've noticed. So public involvement in research is research carried out with or by members of the public rather than to, about or for them. So it's basically where members of the public are collaborators in the research process. They're involved in the design and the conduct and the dissemination. So they're sort of research partners as opposed to sort of participants in research. What it's not is public engagement, which is where information about knowledge and research is provided and disseminated to the public. And it's not public participation, which is where members of the public take part in research. They're sort of participants, or as we used to call subjects. So why do we do it? So there's two main arguments, I guess. There's the consequentialist argument, which suggests that we do it because we get better quality research as a result of doing it. And the second argument is the moral argument that suggests that we have a moral obligation to involve people in research. If they pay for it, they should be involved in how it's conducted and the questions that it asks. And that's quite a difficult argument to sort of ignore, really. So we'll come back to those 2 points when we talk about measuring the impact, because I think they're kind of relevant on how we decide we're going to measure the impact of research and what we do as a result of that impact. So in terms of what are the benefits and how do we measure impact, because we're all about measuring impact, aren't we? So there's a huge body of research looking at the potential impact of patient and public involvement on the quality of research. So the suggestions are that you get more patient-centered research questions. If you ask patients living with a condition what they want to explore in terms of research around that condition, you're going to get more patient-centered research questions. You might get more patient-centered outcomes. So instead of measuring a biomarker or a range of movement, you might get an outcome that's more relevant to the problem of living with that condition, and then therefore you might get research that targets that outcome more effectively. You might get more efficient recruitment strategies. So if you're going to patients and asking them about sort of their willingness to be recruited at certain points in the pathway, it might help you decide where you're going to try and target patients and how you're going to try and draw them into the study. That might result in better recruitment rates. You might get better adherence to interventions if patients have been involved in the design of those interventions. So that's kind of what impact is about, I suppose, or the potential benefits. Now, in terms of measuring the impact of patient and public involvement, this is quite interesting. So I guess historically it's been measured a bit like an intervention. You know, you can design studies that have patient and public involvement and studies that don't, and you can look at the difference in recruitment rates. So you're choosing a variable to measure recruitment rate, and you're looking at the impact of involving patients and public in that outcome. In order to do that well, you need to know what the outcomes are going to be. And there's lots of things about involving patients in research where you don't know what impact they're going to have. And that's kind of part of the beauty of it. So you don't know what you're going to be measuring because you don't know what you don't know. So there's an issue around some of those quantitative measures of evaluating patient involvement in clinical research. And there's a really interesting article by Staley and Barron sort of challenging the concept that it's an intervention. In fact, you know, saying that if it's part of the research process, then we shouldn't be evaluating it like an intervention. We should just be working out how to do it well. We should be recording and measuring the impact of it, but that impact might be more wide-reaching than quantifiable measures. And the definition is quite, the new definition is quite interesting, which we'll come to in a minute. So there's lots of unknowns. So in my research, I went to a patient group and asked them questions about the willingness to be recruited into my study. So I was planning on recruiting from a surgical waiting list. I was expecting the patients on the waiting list to have had physio already, because that's how you sort of generally the pathway that you take. You'd fail physio, then you'd be referred to orthopedics, you'd be listed for surgery. When I designed the study, you were waiting 18 to 36 weeks for your surgery. So I went to the patients on that pathway and said, what would you do? Would you be interested in joining a physiotherapy study if I tried to recruit you at this point in your care pathway, given the fact that you've probably already failed to respond to physiotherapy? So I was going with some known unknowns. You know, I was saying, how would you feel about recruitment at that point? But what came back was a load of unknown unknowns, you know, things that I wasn't expecting that had profound impact on everything that happened next. So one of the things that pretty much all of the patients in the room, there was 8 of them, 7 out of 8 of them made some fairly strong pathoanatomical comment about how does exercise fix tendon tears or, you know, sort of change bony osteophytes or, you know, sort of change the shape of my AC joint. So we had that kind of strong pathoanatomical perspective, and that might have been because they'd been undergone some kind of diagnostic interventions through the orthopedic team. They'd all been had imaging, and they were on a surgical pathway, which is obviously very pathoanatomical. But that's where I was going to be recruiting patients from. So I needed to kind of take that seriously. But that wasn't what I was expecting. And that changed the whole sort of journey of my PhD, really, in response to that unknown unknown. So now how do we measure it? Well, it's the changes, benefits, and learning gained from the insights and experiences of patients and the public when working in partnership with researchers. So this is the Denegri's 2019 definition or description of how we measure impact. So it's changes, benefit, and learning. And they're kind of hard to quantify sometimes. So they're sort of really recommending that when people talk about the impact of involving patients in their research, that they incorporate this kind of sort of reflective statement and this description of the impact of involving patients, not only on recruitment rates or, you know, selection of outcome measures or, you know, sort of lay summaries, but actually the impact on the researcher and how it's changed their journey. So this is a graphical summary, I suppose, of my PhD. I think you can see my cursor. So the orange is the patient and public involvement, and above the blue line was the start of my PhD. So I did a patient and public involvement group, and those comments that I've just talked about made me start thinking about adherence and behaviour change techniques and the patient perspective. So obviously that fed into the application, but it also fed into the feasibility study setup. And it was definitely, patients were involved in the design of the exercise interventions, but also heavily involved in the development of the behaviour change interventions, because we drew on their experience. I fed back my educational interventions and my exercise interventions to my patient group, and we tweaked and modified them based on their feedback. And we talked a lot about kind of patient experience and their experience of doing physiotherapy, what they liked, what they didn't like. that was quite important. It ended up feeding into one of the training. So I had eight physiotherapists that we trained up in the end to deliver the interventions as part of the RCT. And one of the training sessions for the physiotherapists was to sit down for an hour and talk to the patient representatives about their experience of physiotherapy. It was to try and maintain a sort of a patient-centered focus on a randomized controlled trial, which is kind of fairly protocol driven. So it was trying to kind of maintain that patient connection and that sort of patient perspective in that physiotherapy context. And that had a big impact on the design of the qualitative study. So ended up looking at patients' experience of doing exercise, and we did a follow-up, so I suppose exploratory qualitative study, looking at adherence and the barriers or enablers to home exercise adherence. And it also fed into the systematic review, looking at the utilization of behavior change techniques, and it became about adherence. And that's recently been accepted for publication in Physical Therapy Reviews after a long and drawn out submission process. So I suppose the other stage in the design of the setup, just to give you some ideas about how I involved public in the setup of the study, I did an informed consent rehearsal where we sort of sat down with two of the patient representatives. One of them pretended to be the patient, and I was kind of doing an informed consent, and the other one was kind of observed, and we went through this kind of informed consent sort of interview, and we videoed it and we fed back, and they told me what I was doing wrong, and how I was using wrong kind of words. I wasn't being clear about how I was being using jargon, all that kind of stuff. So informed consent's really important, because if people end up with joining a study that they don't really understand what's in store, there's a great chance of dropout, and then you start looking at things like risk of bias. So it's really important that people understand where they're going in terms of when they're joining your studies. So I thought that was a really interesting use of patient and public involvement to help my informed consent interview go more smoothly. And then this is just a summary of my patients. This is a timeline through my PhD fellowship, and these are all the areas in which I involved patients and public along the way. Things like sending them Christmas cards, sort of just because there's big gaps sometimes when you're doing research. They're involved quite actively at certain points, and then there's big lulls. So in those lulls, I was trying to keep them engaged and involved in the process. So my top tips about how to do patient and public involvement well: involve patients early. Before you've decided what you're going to do, because it's quite hard to rewrite your protocol or your sort of research question if you decide that it's quite hard to listen to things if you've kind of already decided what you're going to do. So the earlier the better. Engage the RDS. It was fantastic. I had Duncan Barron that sort of guided me through the process, and he was really helpful at selecting which patients to draw into the group going forward. Invest in the relationship. Treat them like experts, because they have got the experiential knowledge that we haven't got. Revisit and collaborate. So revisit what they say, take it back to them and clarify. And there's a great resource, UK Standards for Public Involvement, which I think is really straightforward, really easy to use, and a great resource for patient and public involvement. And that's me done. Thank you. Do we have some questions?
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to all the speakers. Actually, it's been very informative. We have a couple of questions, so I'll start with the first one, and this is to the whole panel. So have you found any correlation